Tonight, I want to tell you about a god who gave up everything to know everything. Not a god of thunder or war, though he could command both, but a god of questions. A god who looked at the cosmos he had helped to build and realized, with a chill that no fire could warm, that he did not understand it. And so he did something that no god in any mythology had ever done before. He tortured himself. He hung from the branches of a tree so vast that its roots held the universe together, a spear driven through his own side, and he dangled there for 9 days and 9 nights, refusing food, refusing water, refusing even the comfort of his own divine power, all for the chance to glimpse something hidden in the spaces between life and death. His name was Odin, and the knowledge he won would cost him more than any mortal has ever paid for anything. If you find these ancient stories as fascinating as I do, go ahead and subscribe. We tell a new one every week, and the Norse myths are some of the most extraordinary ever imagined. Now, before we follow Odin to the foot of that great tree, you need to understand the world he lived in. Because the Norse cosmos was nothing like the tidy heavens of Greece or the ordered bureaucracy of Chinese mythology. It was wild, tangled, and deeply strange. Imagine a tree, not an ordinary tree, but one so impossibly large that its canopy stretches across the entire sky, and its roots burrow down through layers of existence that no living creature was ever meant to see. The Norse called it Yggdrasil, the world tree, and it was an ash tree of unimaginable scale. Its trunk rose through the center of everything. Its 3 great roots reached into 3 separate wells, each one a source of cosmic power. One root plunged into Asgard, the realm of the gods, where it drew water from the well of Urd, tended by the 3 Norns, the weavers of fate, who sat beneath the tree carving destiny into its bark with knives that never dulled. Another root reached down into Jotunheim, the land of the giants, where it drank from Mimir's well, the source of all wisdom. And the 3rd root descended into Niflheim, the frozen underworld, where the dragon Nidhogg gnawed ceaselessly at the wood, trying to bring the whole structure crashing down. The bark of Yggdrasil was rough as granite, grey-green with lichen, and if you pressed your ear against it, they said you could hear the faintest hum, like the sound the universe makes when it thinks no one is listening. An eagle perched in its highest branches, staring out across the worlds with eyes like polished amber. A squirrel named Ratatoska ran up and down the trunk all day, carrying insults between the eagle and the dragon, because even the world tree had its gossip. 4 deer grazed on its lower branches, eating the new growth, and honeydew dripped from its leaves to feed the bees of the world below. This was the architecture of Norse reality. 9 worlds, stacked and nested within the branches and roots of a single living thing. Asgard above, where the gods feasted in great wooden halls lit by the glow of eternal fires. Midgard in the middle, the realm of humans, connected to Asgard by the shimmering rainbow bridge called Bifrost, which was not made of light as we imagine rainbows, but of fire, trembling and alive, strong enough to bear the weight of gods, but destined one day to shatter. Below them both lay Niflheim and Hel, realms of ice and the restless dead, where mist hung in the air like breath on a winter morning, and the only sound was the slow drip of melting frost. And through all these worlds moved Odin. He was not like Zeus, sitting on a marble throne hurling lightning at anyone who displeased him. Odin was restless. He was a wanderer, a seeker, a god who disguised himself as an old man in a broad-brimmed hat and a dusty grey cloak, walking the roads of Midgard with a staff in his hand, asking questions of mortals and testing their hospitality. He had 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory, and every dawn he sent them flying across the 9 worlds to bring him news. Every evening they returned to perch on his shoulders, their claws gripping the fabric of his cloak, whispering everything they had seen into his ears. He feared, he once admitted, that one day thought might not return, but he feared even more for memory. Think about that for a moment. A god who feared losing his own memory. That tells you everything about what kind of deity Odin was. He was not a god of certainty. He was a god haunted by what he did not know. And what haunted him most was Ragnarok. Ragnarok was not simply the end of the world. Every culture has an apocalypse myth, from the Hindu dissolution of the cosmos at the end of each kalpa, to the Christian book of Revelation, to the Maya belief in cyclical world ages. But Ragnarok was unique, because the Norse gods knew exactly how it would happen and knew they could not prevent it. The great wolf Fenrir would break his chains. The world serpent Jormungandr would rise from the ocean, its coils flooding every shore. Loki, the trickster, would lead an army of the dead against the gods, and one by one, every god would fall. Thor would kill the serpent, but die from its venom. Odin would be swallowed whole by the wolf. The sun would go dark. The stars would vanish. And the world tree itself would tremble and groan as its roots gave way. The gods knew all this. They knew it in the way you know that winter is coming, not as a guess, but as a certainty carved into the bones of the world. And yet they went on living, feasting, loving, fighting, building, preparing, not because they believed they could change their fate, but because they believed that how you meet your fate is the only thing that truly matters. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. This is what Odin was seeking when he went to the world tree. Not a way to escape Ragnarok, but the wisdom to understand it, to face it with clear eyes and an unbroken spirit. And the price of that wisdom was terrible. The first sacrifice came at Mimir's well. Mimir was a being of immense age, perhaps older than the gods themselves, a guardian who had sat beside his well since before time had a name. His well lay beneath the root of Yggdrasil that reached into Jotunheim, and its waters contained all the wisdom of the world, every secret, every truth, every pattern that connects cause to effect across the span of time. The surface of the water was still as black glass, and if you gazed into it, they said you could see not just the past and the future, but the reasons behind them. the hidden architecture of fate itself. Odin came to Mimir alone. The air around the well was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of deep earth and wet stone and something older, something that smelled the way silence sounds. He asked for a single drink. Mimir looked at the Allfather with ancient, unblinking eyes and named his price. An eye, not a symbolic eye, not a metaphorical sacrifice, but Odin's actual eye, plucked from his own skull and dropped into the well, where it would sink slowly through the dark water, staring upward forever. Imagine standing at the edge of that well, knowing what it would cost. The cold air on your face, the absolute stillness of a place where even the wind does not reach. The knowledge that once done, it cannot be undone. And then reaching up with your own hand. Odin did not hesitate. He tore out his eye and dropped it into the well, and the splash it made was the only sound in the world. Then he cupped his hands, bent low and drank. What he saw in that moment, no saga fully tells. The poems say he gained the knowledge of runes, of magic, of the hidden connections between all things. But some scholars believe what he truly gained was the ability to see the pattern, the way events weave together like threads on a loom, how a choice made in one world ripples through all the others. He lost depth perception, the ability to see the world as most beings see it, in exchange for a vision that reached deeper than any two eyes ever could. And it is worth pausing here to notice that this motif, the sacrifice of sight for insight, appears in mythologies around the world. The Greek prophet Tiresias was blind but could see the future. In Hindu tradition, the third eye of Shiva represents divine knowledge that transcends ordinary vision. Even in Chinese mythology, the legendary sage Kangji, who is said to have invented writing, was depicted with 4 eyes, the extra pair granting him the ability to perceive the hidden patterns of nature. The idea that true wisdom requires giving up something precious, that knowledge has a cost, and that cost must be paid in the currency of the body, runs through human storytelling like an underground river. But Odin was not finished. The wisdom of Mimir's well was vast, but it was not complete. There were deeper secrets still, older than the well itself, and to reach them, Odin would have to go further than any god had ever gone. He went to Yggdrasil. The tree stood in the center of all things, its trunk wider than any hall in Asgard, its bark scarred by centuries of the Norns' carvings. The wind moved through its branches with a sound like distant singing, and the leaves, each one as large as a warrior's shield, rustled with a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, like breathing. Dew gathered on the branches and fell in slow drops that caught the starlight before disappearing into the dark below. Odin took his spear, Gungnir, the weapon that never missed its mark, forged by the dwarves from the heartwood of an ancient tree, and he drove it through his own side, pinning himself to the trunk of the world tree. Then he hung there, suspended between the worlds, swaying gently in the cold wind that blew between the branches. No one came to help him. No god, no giant, no mortal. He had forbidden it. This was a sacrifice that could only be made alone, an offering of himself to himself, the Allfather giving his own body and suffering to the deeper mystery that even gods cannot name. For 9 days and 9 nights he hung there. The wind cut through his cloak and numbed his fingers. Rain fell and soaked him to the bone, and then frost came and turned his wet clothes stiff as iron. His lips cracked. His throat burned with thirst. The wound in his side wept blood that ran down the bark of the tree and dripped into the darkness below. The world around him grew dim, and the boundary between waking and dreaming began to dissolve, so that he could not tell whether the shapes he saw in the dark were visions or memories or something else entirely. Eagles circled overhead, patient and silent, as though waiting. The squirrel Ratatoska paused in its endless errands to stare at him, for once too startled to chatter. On the 9th night, something happened. The old poems describe it in language that strains against the edges of what words can hold. Odin looked down, far down, past the roots, past the wells, past the dragon, into a place where even the Norns had never carved. And there, in that bottomless dark, he saw shapes. Not letters as we understand them, but symbols of power, forms that predated language itself, that had existed since before the first sound was spoken, and would endure after the last star went cold. The runes. He screamed, not in pain, though the pain was vast, but in recognition, the way you might cry out when you suddenly understand something you have been trying to grasp your entire life. He reached down, though his arms were numb and his hands shook with exhaustion, and he seized the runes from the void. And then the rope broke, and he fell. When he rose again, he was changed. The runes were not merely symbols to be carved on stone or wood. They were the source code of reality, the patterns that governed weather and warfare, healing and madness, love and death, the speaking of prophecy and the binding of oaths. Each rune carried a specific power. Fehu, the rune of wealth and cattle. Uraz, the rune of strength and the wild ox. Thurisaz, the rune of giants and thorns. Ansuz, Odin's own rune, the rune of the divine breath, of poetry and inspiration, and the word that calls truth out of silence. With the runes came mastery of Galda, the chanting magic of the Norse world, and Seda, the deeper, stranger magic that most gods considered beneath them, a practice associated with women and shamans, with trance and transformation. Odin did not care about propriety. He wanted knowledge, all of it, every form, every tradition, every secret door that opened onto understanding. And this is where it gets truly remarkable, because the image of Odin hanging on the tree, wounded by a spear, dying and being reborn with transcendent knowledge, is so startlingly similar to other myths that scholars have debated the connections for centuries. In Christianity, Christ hangs on a cross, pierced by a spear, and rises again. In Mesoamerican mythology, Quetzalcoatl immolates himself and is reborn as the morning star. The Buddha sits beneath the Bodhi tree, refusing to move until enlightenment comes. The pattern is ancient and universal, a god or a seeker who must pass through suffering and apparent death to reach a truth that lies on the other side. The Norse called this kind of sacrifice a blot, a sacred offering, and they believed that the greater the gift, the greater the return. But Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil was the greatest blot ever made, because he was both the giver and the gift, the priest and the sacrifice, the question and the answer. Let that image stay with you for a moment. A god hanging on a tree in the dark, between the worlds, bleeding and freezing and burning with thirst, choosing to suffer because he believed that understanding was worth any price. But Odin's hunger for wisdom did not end at Yggdrasil. There was still another treasure he sought, one that had nothing to do with runes or prophecy, but with something perhaps even more powerful, the gift of language itself, the ability to speak in such a way that truth becomes beautiful and beauty becomes truth. This was the mead of poetry, a drink brewed from the blood of a god. The story of its creation is strange, even by the standards of Norse mythology. When the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, two rival families of gods, finally ended, both sides sealed the peace by spitting into a great vat, a ritual that seems crude to modern ears, but carried deep symbolic weight in the old world. From that mingled divine saliva, a being was formed. His name was Kvasir, and he was the wisest creature who had ever lived. He wandered the 9 worlds, answering every question put to him, and no riddle, no puzzle, no mystery could withstand his understanding. The sound of his voice, they said, was like clear water running over smooth stones. But wisdom, as Odin knew better than anyone, attracts not only seekers but predators. 2 dwarves, Fjalla and Gala, invited Kvasir to a feast and murdered him. They drained his blood into 3 vessels, 2 vats called Sun and Bodden, and a kettle called Odrerir, and mixed it with honey. The result was the mead of poetry. Anyone who drank it would become a poet or a scholar, able to speak with the kind of eloquence that moves hearts and reshapes the world. Through treachery and trade, the mead passed from the dwarves to a giant named Suttungr, who locked it deep inside a mountain called Hnitjorg and set his daughter Gunlod to guard it. The entrance was sealed with stone. No path led there, and no key existed. But Odin wanted the mead, and Odin was patient. He disguised himself as a farmhand and went to work for Suttungr's brother, Borgi, mowing fields and doing the labor of 9 men. The work took an entire summer, and through those long days, Odin swung his scythe in the golden grass, the smell of cut hay thick in the warm air, biding his time. When the season ended, he asked for his payment, a single sip of the mead. Borgi could not grant it, for the mead was his brother's, but he agreed to help Odin reach the mountain. Together they bored a hole through the rock with an auger. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a snake. And so Odin transformed himself into a serpent and slithered through the dark passage, the rough stone scraping against his scales, until he emerged inside the mountain chamber where Gunnlod sat alone beside the three vessels. What happened next is told with surprising tenderness in the old poems. Odin stayed with Gunnlod for 3 nights, and she, lonely and perhaps a little in love, allowed him to drink. 1 sip from each vessel, 3 sips, and the mead was gone. Then Odin transformed himself into an eagle, burst from the mountain, and flew toward Asgard with the mead in his crop. Suttungr, discovering the theft, became an eagle himself and gave chase. The 2 great birds raced across the sky, their wings cutting through clouds, their shadows sweeping across the fields of Midgard below. The gods, seeing Odin approach, set out vats in the courtyard of Asgard, and as Odin flew over the walls, he spat the mead into the waiting vessels. A few drops fell outside the walls, scattered by the wind, and these fell to Midgard. Those drops, the Norse believed, are the source of all human poetry, all mortal art. They are the reason some people can arrange words in ways that make others weep, or laugh, or see the world differently than they did a moment before. Every poet, every storyteller, every singer who has ever moved an audience was drinking, without knowing it, from those few scattered drops. Let that thought settle in your mind for a moment, the way a feather settles slowly through still air. And so the Allfather possessed 3 treasures that no other being in the 9 worlds could claim. The sight of Mimir's well, which showed him the hidden weave of cause and consequence. The runes of Yggdrasil, which gave him power over the deep grammar of reality. And the Mead of Poetry, which gave him the words to share what he had learned, to speak truth in forms so beautiful they could pass from mouth to mouth across centuries without losing their power. But Odin did not hoard these gifts. He wandered. He walked the roads of Midgard in his grey cloak, the wide brim of his hat casting a shadow over his missing eye, Gungnir disguised as a walking staff. He knocked on farmhouse doors in the last light of evening and asked for shelter. The Norse had a word for this sacred obligation, the duty to welcome a stranger at your door. They called it gestrisni, and it was one of the highest virtues a mortal could practice, because you never knew whether the old man asking for a cup of mead and a place by the fire might be the Allfather himself. In these wanderings, Odin tested mortals. He asked them riddles and questions about the nature of the world. He challenged kings to games of wit. Sometimes he appeared at feasts uninvited, and those who treated him with generosity found their fortunes blessed, while those who turned him away discovered, too late, what they had lost. There is a tale of a farmer named Geirrod who welcomed a stranger and asked nothing in return, only to wake the next morning and find that his fields had been touched by a richness that no ordinary rain could explain. And it is worth noting that this pattern, the divine traveler who tests human kindness, appears in mythologies across the world. In Greek myth, Zeus and Hermes visited the old couple Baucis and Philemon, rewarding their hospitality when all others turned the gods away. In the Hebrew Bible, Abraham welcomed 3 strangers at Mamre and learned they were angels. In Japanese folklore, the wandering monk who arrives at a poor household and bestows blessings upon the kind is a figure as old as the culture itself. The idea that the divine walks among us in disguise, that our kindness to strangers is being observed by something larger than ourselves, is perhaps the most universal story humanity has ever told. Odin also prepared for what he knew could not be avoided. In the great hall of Valhalla, the hall of the slain, he gathered the bravest warriors who had ever died in battle. The Valkyries, shining maiden warriors who rode across the sky on horses whose manes dripped foam like cloud and sea spray, chose the worthiest of the fallen and carried them to Odin's table. There, in a hall so vast that its rafters were made from spears, and its roof was tiled with golden shields, the Einherjar, the chosen dead, feasted on the meat of the boar Sihrimnir, who was slain and eaten each evening and reborn each dawn, and drank mead that flowed from the udders of the goat Hydran, who grazed on the leaves of the world tree high above. Each day the Einherjar fought one another in the fields outside the hall, their swords ringing against shields, their war cries echoing across the clouds. Each evening their wounds healed, and they sat together at the long tables, laughing and drinking, their armor gleaming in the firelight. They were not practicing for a battle they expected to win. They were practicing for one they knew they would lose. And there is something deeply moving in that, in the image of an army that trains every day for a war it knows is already lost, not out of denial, but out of a belief that the act of preparing, of standing ready, of refusing to surrender to despair, is itself a kind of victory. After the ordeals of the well, the tree, and the mountain, Odin became after the ordeals of the well, the tree, and the mountain. Odin became what the Norse called the Allfather, not because he had created the world, though he had played a part, but because he had paid more than anyone to understand it. His one remaining eye, grey as winter cloud, saw differently now. He could read the runes in the grain of wood and the patterns of frost. He could speak to the dead. He could change his shape, becoming eagle, serpent, or wandering old man. He could compose poetry that shook the foundations of worlds and whisper charms that no other being knew, spells for calming the sea, for dulling the blade of an enemy, for making the hanged speak their last secrets. But the deepest knowledge he gained was this, that wisdom does not prevent suffering. It only gives you the clarity to see why suffering is necessary. He knew that Ragnarok would come. He knew that his son Baldur, the most beautiful and beloved of all the gods, would die before it. He knew that Loki's treachery would shatter the bonds of friendship and trust. He knew all this, and yet he went on gathering warriors to his hall in Valhalla, choosing the bravest of the mortal dead, the Einherjar, to feast and fight and prepare for the last battle, not because he believed they could win, but because he believed that courage in the face of certain defeat was the highest thing a being could aspire to. This is perhaps the most remarkable idea in all of Norse mythology. The gods do not fight because they expect to triumph. They fight because fighting is what gives life its meaning, even when, especially when, the outcome is already known. The ancient Norse understood something that we sometimes forget, something that settles into you slowly, the way snow accumulates on still branches, each flake weightless, but together changing the shape of the world. They understood that the value of a life is not measured by its length or its comfort, but by the quality of the choices made within it. Odin could have remained on his golden throne in Asgard, surrounded by plenty and power, and simply waited for the end. Instead, he chose to seek, to sacrifice, to wander the cold roads of the world in disguise, asking questions of strangers and offering them wisdom in return. He gave his eye for knowledge and his body for the runes and his cunning for the mead of poetry, not because these sacrifices could save him, but because he believed that a life lived in pursuit of understanding, even painful understanding, was the only life worth living. And perhaps that is why this story has endured for more than 1,000 years, whispered first in the smoky longhouses of Scandinavia, where the firelight flickered against the wooden beams and the wind howled outside, and then carried across oceans and centuries to reach us here tonight, because every one of us, in our own way, is searching for something that lies just beyond the reach of what we already know. Every one of us has stood at the edge of a well, knowing that the answer we seek will cost us something, and wondered whether the price is worth paying. Odin's answer was always the same. It is. It always is. The fire crackles low. The branches of Yggdrasil sway in a wind that blows between the worlds, and somewhere in the dark between its roots, an old god's eye stares upward through black water, still watching, still seeking, still remembering everything it ever saw. Speaking of gods who wandered the world in search of what lay hidden beneath the surface of things, there is another tale, perhaps even more ancient, about a time when the great god Thor, the strongest of all the Aesir, journeyed to the fortress of the giants and discovered that nothing, not even his legendary strength, was what it appeared.